All right, let's talk about a concept that is, quite literally, the foundation of any free and fair society, the rule of law. Now, you've probably heard this term thrown around a lot, right? By politicians, on the news, but what does it actually mean? And more importantly, why should you care? Well, we're about to break it all down. So let's just start with a really basic question. What should be in charge of a society? Should it be a clear set of rules that everybody has to follow, or should it be the decisions of powerful people, the rulers? This simple question, it gets right to the very heart of what the rule of law is all about. And here you can see the two extremes laid out. On one hand, you have the rule of law. And this isn't just about having laws. It's about the law itself being the ultimate authority. It means everyone, and I mean everyone, from the person on the street to the person in the highest office, is playing by the exact same rulebook. But on the other side, you have the alternative, arbitrary power, where decisions can change based on a ruler's mood or who their friends are. One system gives you predictability and a shot at fairness. The other, well, that can lead to total chaos and injustice. So how does a concept like this actually work in the real world? Well, you can think of it as resting on three huge, essential pillars. And if any one of them starts to get weak, the whole structure can begin to wobble. Let's take a look at the first one. Our first pillar is what we call legality. The easiest way to think about it is like this. The law basically puts the government inside a box. The government can't just do whatever it wants. It has to have clear legal authority for every single action it takes. This is what stops power from becoming absolute and unpredictable. Now, for this to really work, the laws themselves have to follow certain rules. They have to be public and clear, no secret laws that you can't find. They also need to be pretty stable, so you can actually plan your life around them. And this next one is absolutely crucial. They have to be forward-looking. A government can't just suddenly decide to punish you for something you did last week when it was perfectly legal. That kind of backward-looking law, that is a classic sign of arbitrary rule, not the rule of law. Okay, next up is our second pillar, and this one is a really big deal. Equality before the law. The idea here is so simple, but at the same time, it's pretty radical. The law must be blind. It shouldn't care about your status, your wealth, or how much power you have. So this really means two key things. First, nobody gets a free pass. Not a president, not a police officer, not a billionaire CEO. They all have to answer to the same law as everyone else. And second, the rules themselves are the same for everybody. This makes sure that the law is a consistent standard, not some kind of weapon that can be used against certain people. It's all about creating a level playing field. And that brings us perfectly to our third and final pillar, access to justice. Think about it. What good are all these fair laws if an ordinary person can't actually use them when they need to? This whole principle is about making sure the courthouse doors are genuinely open to everyone. So, a truly fair system needs all these components. You need courts you can actually get to, processes that are impartial and independent, and real ways to challenge the government's decisions. And maybe most importantly, justice can't have a price tag. There has to be help available for people who can't afford a lawyer. Because without all of that, the promise of equality is just that, an empty promise. Okay, so we've got these three powerful ideas, these pillars. But they're still just ideas. How do you actually build a real system, a government that can hold them up? How do you take this theory and make it a reality? Well, a key strategy, one of the most famous ones, is the separation of powers. The thinking behind it is pretty simple. Since power tends to corrupt, you should never put all of it in one place. You split it up. You have one branch that makes the laws, another that enforces them, and a third that interprets them. They all have their own jobs, but they also act as a check on each other, making sure no single branch gets too powerful and runs away with the whole show. Another huge piece of the puzzle is actively upholding people's rights. And that requires a couple of things. First, you need an independent judiciary. Judges have to be like neutral referees, calling the game based on the rulebook, not getting pressured by politicians or public opinion. And second, the system itself must act like a shield, protecting our most basic rights, things like freedom of speech and assembly. You can think of these mechanisms as the guardrails that keep the whole system on the road. Now, as you can imagine, this idea isn't without some really interesting debates. So let's dive just a little deeper into some of the philosophical questions that have been argued over for centuries, shaping how we think about the rule of law. For a bit of historical context, let's look at this really influential 19th century scholar, A.V. Dicey. He basically broke it down into three core ideas. First, you can't be punished unless you've broken a specific law in a proper court. Second, nobody is above that law. And third, the Constitution grows out of the regular law of the land. So many of these ideas still form the bedrock of how we understand the rule of law today. And that brings us to a really fascinating modern debate. On one side, you have what's called the procedural view. This camp focuses on the process. Are the rules public? Are they stable? Are they applied fairly? But on the other side, you have the substantive view. And this side argues that, you know what? That's not enough. They say the laws themselves have to have some moral content. They have to be just and protect basic human rights. So the big question is a fair process enough? Or do the laws themselves also have to be good? So after going through the pillars, the mechanisms, and even the big debates, we have to land on the most important question. Why does any of this really matter? Why is this way more than just some abstract theory for lawyers and philosophers to argue about? Because when you boil it all down, it really comes to this. The rule of law completely flips the script. It transforms law from a weapon for the powerful into a shield that protects us from the powerful. It is quite possibly the most important barrier that stands between a free society and outright tyranny. And that leaves us with one last and maybe the most crucial question of all. You see, the rule of law isn't a description of how the world is. It's an ideal. It's a standard we're constantly trying to reach. So the question for every single one of us is this: how well are we actually doing? How well are we living up to that ideal?